as I was going through tonight's book, Sporting Time, I figured, as we talk about the development of sport, cricket's got to be in here somewhere, at least for a mention. So I am.
Well, it's one of the things that I'd
I've
wanted to
got my
bring up
wool
here.
cricket hat.
Oh, cool. One of the things I wanted to bring up here, actually, and it's one of the things that blew my mind when I read this book, a question I never actually thought much about, which is look at how much culture we inherited from England. Our language, our tendency to fry things, so much, and yet baseball, not cricket.
Yeah.
Like, until I read this book, I'd never actually given that a lot of thought. Like, why did we inherit everything else and yet ditched their national game?
True enough, because the only place in America that it kept at least some measure of notability was Philadelphia, with the Philadelphia Cricket Club.
Also Connecticut.
Is that right?
Connecticut,
yeah, Connecticut in particular, the variant called Wicket.
Wicket.
Ah, okay.
Wicket,
Yeah.
Joanne can tell us about Wicket.
Yes, I did. I did a whole story on Wicket in Connecticut and Western Massachusetts and all that. But there is the Longwood Cricket Club in Brookline, just outside of Boston, right around the corner from BC. And I'm not really sure how much cricket they're actually playing there, but I trust they are. But there are a lot of cricket teams around the Boston area, especially due to the large number of Asian immigrants coming over and working in the industries around Boston, medical and otherwise. And right down the street, a couple of miles down the road from me, there is a cricket pitch.
That makes sense.
It's
huge in India.
Yeah, it is. And like, what is it, MathWorks, which is a huge company outside of Boston. And that's where one of the teams actually is playing out of. And I know I keep meaning to get down there to watch the games and everything. I did once and talk to a few of the guys and all that. But yes, last year I did do a story about Wicket in Connecticut and had spoken to them about it. And there was a competition there right up until the late 19th century, fighting over about, in Connecticut, as the paper said, don't you dare say that Wicket is just cricket in another form. They said, no, we are before. We were the ones that created cricket, not them. They're creating it. Oh my, it was great. But they were very highly, there was a popular sport all through, like Worcester on West. But it didn't seem like to do much before Worcester. And great games. One thing that caught my eye about it was that in those games, they would give the full names of the players, not just their last names like baseball does. So you could trace these people, do biographical sketches on them. And some of them were fantastic. The ones that went crazy, the ones that were in jail for murder. They ended up in jail for murder after their playing days.
That's not the only place. I lost it, unfortunately. But I had in my hands for a while an article in which someone had tracked the number of early professional catchers who had ended up in insane asylums or in jail.
Yeah, marvelous. Sounds like a Peter Morris deal. Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, it turns out stopping foul balls with your face is not good for your health.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
Marty Bergen is the famous one. Yeah. And Hirschberger.
Yeah.
Hirschberger.
Yeah, Pinch Thomas, he ended up in insane asylum outside of San Francisco, and he was hit in the head several times, well known. Who was it? The pitch that killed, Carol Mays actually.
Carl Mays,
yeah.
Carl Mays hit him, actually hit Pinch Thomas in the head. I wonder. I think there was only one time out of many.
But before we leave off Wicket, though, answer me this, if you can. Is there any truth, and I read this and I cannot confirm it, that the strip of dirt sometimes found between the pitcher's mound and home plate is a survival of Wicket?
I have heard that too. Yeah, I've heard that too, and I can't really, I can't narrow it down because all of the articles that I looked at in Connecticut, no pictures. No sketches or anything like that to give us that idea, but I have seen that written. Yeah. And I believe it was also mentioned in a Peter Morris, one of his books. which if you haven't seen any of his, they're like, oh my God, you should have the whole series. It's great. Yeah.
Cool. Anyway.
He puts in little factoids like that in 2 of his books. It's just, they're encyclopedic, but you look through it and everything and you find little things like that, little discussions, marvelous. Plus he wrote a whole book on catchers anyway. So
I remember, Joanne, you said you have them all last time, didn't you?
yes, I do.
Yeah,
I get them all.
You have them all. His indexes are good too. I love a good index, and his index is always great.
Who is this we're talking about?
Peter Morris.
Yeah.
Would you, someone mind putting that in the chat so I can remember?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll do it.
Yeah, because I will. These are things I will forget. Also,
I think
Joanne,
his game of inches is just
The
incredible.
Game of Inches, yeah. And then the companion book that goes along with it. One time I was sitting getting my car repaired and everything, and I was sitting there reading the book, and the mechanic came out to talk to me about the car and everything. And he's looking, what are you reading? And I showed him. He said, oh, let me write that down. He said, that looks really cool. He wrote it down, so maybe he even bought it. I don't know.
Joanne, what's the companion book? I didn't know there was a companion book to that.
Yes, wait a minute, let me get it.
2 volumes.
I was going to ask if she had a link to the Wicked story because I wanted to read that. So I was trying to ask. Peter Morris, Game of Inches. Got it.
Yeah.
Because that's
they're both Game of Inches, and the first one, the Game Behind the Scenes.
Okay.
Oh.
Do you have a link to that Wicked story you were talking about?
Well, the one that I did.
Yeah.
I can send it to you.
Please, because I would love to. I would love to read that.
Yeah.
You did that presentation. You did that presentation at the Fred, Joanne. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, a year ago. Yeah, I know it was a delightful story to follow up on, and I still see it mentioned in newspapers and everything, and make note of it when I do see them. It crops up every now and then.
Well, shall we? It's 8 o'clock. Should we jump into this then?
If you would like to, Peter, if you'd like to introduce our moderator and open our meeting.
Well, I will just say this about Kevin, is that he picked a book here that is a very, very serious book. When you read it now, I think it's published in 86.
Well, it was his dissertation originally, cut down from something like 600 pages.
Right.
My copy says U of Illinois Press. Mine is a 1990 edition, but
yeah, 90,
I do not know when it was originally. Hang on, 1986, Board of Trustees, University of Illinois. Illini Book Edition, 1990. Okay, so mine is a second printing.
Yeah.
The original.
I believe, the original is 1986. I have a first edition of it.
Yeah.
And I did actually read it many years ago. And I remember the impression it made on me many years ago. And of course, what's happened since 1986 is there has been a lot of revelation and so forth and so on. So I don't fault him, for like some of the inconsistencies in the beginning when he's talking about the Knickerbocker play and so forth and so on.
That's what I thought too.
Because there is some earlier things that were happening in New York, but they didn't come to the surface or were discovered until after he authored this book. But I remember this book being a real eye opener into how, baseball got up the steam it did in New York, particularly given the entire sporting environment in New York. And one of his observations was that he compared Boston to Athens with the philosophical play.
Well, the Bostonians did that themselves.
He compared to New York. He compared New York to London economically and Paris socially.
Yeah,
I thought it was very, very interesting.
We'll let Kevin get started here, but where I come from in Kentucky, it's Athens.
Really? Oh, yeah.
It's a little town outside of Lexington. It's Athens, Kentucky. Kevin, please start us off.
Okay, I was gonna actually point to some of that stuff you were talking about. That this book is in some ways dated. But that's because so much new research has been done. And realistically, that's because Adelman was one of the first to do so. Up until the 1980s, we really didn't have historians who took sports seriously. I mean, I still get funny looks sometimes. Like tomorrow, for instance, I intend to focus much of a lecture class on the growth of sporting culture in the United States, well, in the colonial era. And I get funny looks sometimes because there were years when people did not think sports were a subject for history. So this book, mind-blowing is the word you want here, because in a lot of ways, he's one of the trailblazers in this. The thing that struck me, and the place that really, the two things really. One is the way he does a class analysis. It doesn't hold up so well from modern research, especially with Jim Thorne's discovery. Jim Thorne?
John.
Thorne.
Thorne.
John Thorne. I knew I was wrong. John Thorne's discovery of the Magnolia Club, which is only about 10 years old, if that. So his class analysis kind of breaks down with modern research, but can't fault him for that. We didn't know at the time. But even more so, the thing that really blew my mind was until I read this book, I had never thought to ask one of the most fundamental questions in the whole history of the sport. Why baseball, not cricket? Why did we get everything else from British culture? Our language, our accents, our taste for fried chicken and potatoes, seriously, all of that, a tendency to our laws, our structure of government, are so much of our culture. And yet this most British of things that they love in so many other colonies and former colonies, we rejected. And it never occurred to me to ask. And Adelman takes that question up in a way that I don't know if he totally succeeds at it. But the very fact that he starts with that he brings that question to the fore is why I had to grab this book when someone said, well, what about a book for the 19th century club? Like this one. Baseball is our national game. And by 1860, as some of you probably already know, magazines were already referring to baseball as our national game.
Mm-hmm.
So how does that start that early? That's what caught me. And should I answer my own question, or am I leaving this one open? Because I can.
Well, there's a lot of talk about cricket just being slower, different. It didn't, the batter only got the 2 innings shot, and he could go all day before if he made it hit the wicket before he got a whole bunch of runs in. So and I don't know whether sometimes we give a reason after the fact in that baseball became the national pastime, therefore it had to be superior, and we create all sorts of things around it for that reason.
You just nailed one of the key things that people often do, is working backward, which as historians we don't want to do, because people aren't working from the future back to the past. And much of the answer to that question before I read Adelman's book really did partake of that. It's a faster game, it's a more American game, but that's kind of looking at it from the wrong end of the telescope. That's imagining that the characteristics that we think of as baseball are somehow American, and therefore the characteristics of American must be baseball. His answer, I think, is more interesting and more subtle. What he points to is the fact that baseball was in flux, cricket wasn't. Not speed, not skill, because cricket players came to America and kicked some people's behinds seriously in the 1850s. But he talks about the nature of the fact that baseball was a game in flux. The rules are not yet established. Whereas 1744, laws of cricket. 1787, Marylebone Cricket Club becomes, and I think as far as I know remains, those who know cricket better, correct me here, remains the center of organized cricket. As in, we are the keepers of the rules. We tell you how you can play. We tell you what goes here and what doesn't. And baseball was play it how you like. You got dozens of variants. You got as many guys as you want. Got 2 guys? Let's play some old cat. Got 20 guys? Good. 10 on a side works. We could do that. Got 6 guys, 2 old cat, 4 old cat. Pick the number of bases you like for the number of guys you got. You could do it anywhere. Play cricket with 6 guys and watch the cricket lords freak out. That's not cricket. Play baseball with 6 on a side, you're still playing baseball. And his argument, part of it comes down to that Americans preferred a game that they could rewrite the rules for at their convenience. And we did a lot. Most of you are probably familiar with the difference between the New York and the Maryland game. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because he makes a point of that's a good example of the way the game is in flux. How you got town ball style in Philadelphia, Maryland game in Boston, the New York game in New Jersey, and also New York. Notice how even then things that are called New York are happening in Jersey. We're looking at you, football teams. Well, for those of you who failed to notice, we have 2 New York football teams, neither of whom there are 3 New York football teams. Only one of them actually has their home stadium in the state of New York. Buffalo. Yeah, not the other 2.
Excuse me for just a moment. Joanne?
Yeah. Yeah.
We can hear you typing.
Oh.
Oh, that's what that is.
Oh, okay.
Yep. No worries.
Okay.
So anyway, that's kind of where I wanted to start with that, with the nature of that revelation and the idea. Is this a better way to look at why baseball becomes our national game? Because if we're doing it that early, if we're agreeing by 1860, if it's showing up in magazines, there's a political cartoon from 1860 that shows Abraham Lincoln winning a baseball game. It's already become a national thing. Is that why, not cricket? Because I never was vexed by the question until I read this book. Does it work for people?
I was doing some research on the early Chicago Cubs for a book I was working on, and I came across a really neat editorial. It was either in the New York Times or the Chicago Tribune. It talked about how the Civil War had a lot to do with the popularity of baseball, because, and what an editorial said, it really stressed that, the war was tough and that people just needed some relaxation, and they kept on using the word play a lot. People want to play, and baseball really fit the bill for this, with the 2 opposing teams, and people could get out, and if they didn't play the game, they could enjoy watching it. And it was a well-known editorial. I think it was reprinted a couple of times, but they kept stressing, this is the time now. The war is over. It's time to go back to work, or at least go work, but it's time to enjoy the sport too.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But the first references we have to baseball as the national game, I believe the first is 1857.
Yeah.
I want to say Brooklyn Eagle. Don't quote me on that. I don't have it in front of me. But
Yeah.
by 1860, it's become a standard to refer to it as the national game,
Right.
which means we're still pre-Civil War.
The pre-Civil War, yeah.
So we can't look at the Civil War as, no doubt, the Civil War spread the game dramatically.
Yeah.
And probably had something to do with the New York game becoming more prominent. Although Adelman argues it's really the strength of New York's media that spread the New York game over the Massachusetts one.
Is there some level of class here that cricket was always the upper class?
Yeah.
In England, and when it came here, it was big city teams, and they played cricket and that sort of thing. And baseball, at least, spread to at least the suburban or the more rural areas, because it could just be picked up, because it didn't need a lot of equipment, didn't need the space cricket needed.
There's something to that, and Adelman's argument basically tracks baseball players as largely middle class and lower middle class. Notice a lot of his players, for instance, are members of the food service trades. So they're people who are butchers, bakers, food service people. In other words, people who have a small business or work in a small business, who can also take time off. If you're a butcher, you can get everything done by 2 or 3 o'clock. Show up at work early, get all your work done by 2 or 3 o'clock, and there's still time in the day to get a game in before dark. The thing about that is, the upper class of places like New York have a tendency to embrace things like horse racing and yachting. more so than cricket. So is there a class element to it? Yeah, probably. Is it as simple as that? Probably not. Because
But
it's you find middle class cricket players too. Oh,
that
sorry.
time in the afternoon you were mentioning, time enough to do a baseball game, but
Yeah.
not enough time for a cricket match.
Yeah, which he brings in as well. Unless, of course, you play variants of cricket that can be played in shorter time.
But
which
that,
there are.
as the old saying goes, his point about the fixed rules, that
Yeah.
ain't cricket.
Exactly. So you can do it, but then the folks who claim it's not cricket are looking down their nose at you.
Yeah.
They can't stop you. They can sneer at you. And they will. A lot. Loudly. And if you care about such things, that's going to bother you. Not everybody does. Because Adelman gives us a really good statistical analysis by class in terms of the people who play the game in New York. And I think that's honestly one of the strengths of the book, because I don't think that analysis holds up as well as anything. That's just data for what it is. I mean, there's more data now. So his percentages may no longer apply, but the data he's got is still good data.
Speaking of class, Kevin, I noticed he said that the Knickerbockers were mostly the urban upper class, but I've seen other things that said that the Knickerbockers were kind of more middle class than upper class. I'm not, I've seen two schools of thought on that, but I know he does stress class a lot in the book, and I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, which is something you don't see in sports much, but he's a student of people like Eric Hobsbawm, who were big into understanding history through the lens of class.
Mm-hmm.
So no surprise. As far as I know, the Knickerbockers were mostly what we would think of as upper middle class.
Mm-hmm.
Like they were not, most of them were not rich, but none of them were poor. Like what's his face? Not Cartwright. Wheaton. William Wheaton, I think it was, owned a bookstore.
Right.
I mean, he's not poor. He owns a business. On the other hand, you don't get to be a millionaire owning a bookstore. I mean, unless it's online and you sell a million other things and bust unions and the rest. For the rest of us, you don't get to be a millionaire owning a bookstore, but you do all right. You own a bookstore, you're comfortable. You could afford nice things in life, and you could afford to take time off to play baseball. A couple of them were clerks. One of them, I think, was a lawyer. But he also emphasizes the connections with some lower class players, in particular the Mutual, who start their career as fire rowdies.
Mm-hmm.
The Mutual Club of New York are named for a fire company. And let's face it, in this era, fire companies are one part firefighting, one part street gang, and one part political enforcer.
Mm-hmm.
In particular, the Mutual, they're thugs for Tammany Hall.
Yeah,
Boss Tweed owned but paid into the team. He effectively owned a share of that club, and everybody's heard of him, right?
Yeah, jumping to the mutuals, I mean, is quite a big jump from the discussion about cricket and baseball.
Yeah.
What kind of caught my eye in this book when I reread it. I reread at least the chapters that had to do with ball.
Yeah.
When I originally read the book, I did read the whole book, but this time to reread it, I just read everything that had to do with the ball.
I figured we'd focus on that for this.
Yeah.
But one thing that caught my eye particularly was that the newspapers had already given cricket a modern, and that page 9, that comparison of pre-modern and modern elements. What were the pre-modern elements and what were the modern elements? In other words, when you talk about something like newspaper reporting and starting to put up statistics and kind of creating things like line scores, they originally came out of cricket. And the newspapers were already engaged in that kind of reporting before or just around the time the first baseball games are being played by organized clubs. So cricket does, create that model for baseball in that regard. how it appears and how it's reported and so forth and so on. And that's what I got out of the book. It's 1839, the season of 1839, 1840, that the St. George, and what does that imply? Of course, it implies the UK. The St. George Cricket Club is created in New York. So that's early. And, from that, I mean, that really created a lot of excitement because that was going to be now the dominant cricket club in the country. And it was almost completely, Brits who played it.
And he makes a point of that they chose the name St. George when they could have very easily chosen a more American sounding name. That they're waving their Britishness in your face by calling themselves that as compared to a million other choices.
Exactly.
They certainly were plenty of other choices that they could have gone with. So maybe part of it is that too, is that the connection to British identity, which the members of the St. George very clearly were invested in a way that other would-be sports people were not. When you start out like that, you're clinging to that identity as not American, but English.
Well, it sounded like, excuse me, most of the St. George club members, were British born or immigrants as adults or young people.
Many of them were. And by the way, that part about adults and young people is one I wanted to circle back to at some point, because that's something else that plays into the business of why baseball. The shift from baseball as a game for children to baseball as a game for adults. And that early sense of adults who don't want to be seen doing this because it's a childish activity, to adults who are saying, we're doing this and we're good with it, and you should be too. This is healthful, it's manly, that manly thing. The beginning of the obsession with gender roles.
What in the early, I think in the introduction, they talk of society started to get concerned that as urban areas grew, and jobs became more sedentary, and we have the same thing going today, that the people were not getting the exercise and were becoming less fit. And when they weren't farmers and dealing with trades and that sort of thing. And does that play into this also?
Oh yeah. That's a big part of where some of that obsession with gender roles that the later 19th century is going to develop starts to develop.
Is that
Not
where
all of it, but
manly? Is that where manly Christianity comes from?
1845 or 1844, for instance, YMCA. It's the exact same era. This obsession with the idea that a manly physique goes hand in hand with a healthy mind and a religious life. And the YMCA launched in England, and within 10 years, it was all over the East Coast of the United States. The first one in Buffalo opened in 1854. 10 years after London, they're already in Buffalo.
There's no doubt about that. There's no doubt about muscular Christianity and the, arriving on the scene just about the time that adult baseball as a serious club sport starts arriving on the scene.
Yeah.
What I always reflect on, and I don't want to put too much emphasis on it because it really comes not so much from this book, but I always think of Harry Wright, and I think of his father, Sam Wright, being a professional cricket player. And Sam Wright coming to New York as an adult, Harry, of course, and George and little Sam are only children. But Sam Sr. is a cricket professional who brings, and I think that the influence that he had on Harry Wright was this idea that baseball could somehow follow at least the organization and practice and so forth that cricket did, and cricket was like a mature game, and I think Harry kind of felt that.
That's a great point, because that connection is very important, and of course, Harry being one of the key figures in professionalizing baseball and doing so overtly. There were people being paid to play the game before him, but nobody was doing so overtly and visibly. Lip Pikeman probably got paid as early as 1860. Harry, I'm losing his name, the guy who did drop dead very young. Suddenly his name has disappeared from my head.
Jim Creighton.
Jim Crichton, thank you.
Mhm.
All of a sudden I couldn't think of his name. Who was almost certainly getting paid, but not overtly as a baseball player. Even if everybody knew, nobody was willing to come out in public and say, we are paying this man just to play baseball.
Well, at that time, they also had rules for the association of baseball clubs that said they were amateurs. So they had to find a way around that.
Yeah,
Mhm.
and that's going to play into that whole divide between the association and then the attempt at an amateur association and that whole mess, to put it politely.
That was the kind of the post-Civil War fight.
Yeah. Takes us in a sense beyond the range of this book, because most of that mess is going to blow up in the mid-1870s as the association falls to pieces, and then what follows. And eventually, of course, the National League, with the emphasis on clubs rather than players. And that's something that I bring up in class, the fact that the National League is a league of clubs, not a league of ball players.
Mhm.
And that key difference in professionalizing. Sorry,
What I
Jack, you were
found
going to add something?
most interesting also was that he brings out in the book how cricket is really dominant, is the dominant bat and ball game of the early 19th century. And by 1840, 1860, they're both there, they're both present.
Yeah.
What the mystery is, in a sense, is not why baseball grew, but why cricket shrank.
That's another way to look at it, and a really good one.
Yeah, it ultimately becomes almost non-existent. I don't want to say it doesn't exist. I happened to play center field in Walker Park on Staten Island when I was a kid, and I played on a cricket patch and today that's the most active, that's the longest active cricket club in the United States. The Staten Island Cricket Club. But today, when you go down to watch it, it is almost entirely being played by people from India, or people at least of Indian descent, because one of the hospitals is right up the street, and I think every player is a doctor.
Well, cricket remains ridiculously popular in India. It is the sport of choice in India. Still
and in much of the British Empire.
Yeah, Australia likewise, where it remains the game of choice, but not here. And Australia is a good counterpoint, because Australia is a settlement colony, inhabited almost entirely at one point by European descended peoples who pushed out and swamped with numbers the native people, to the point where the native people were a small minority in their own nation, and the European descended settlers were the majority. And yet their cricket, here baseball. But yeah, the way you put the question backward is really good. It's not just why baseball became the national game, but why cricket failed. Why did cricket not remain popular? As baseball grew, cricket not only didn't grow, it actively shrank. And that's a tough thing to come to grips with too.
Oops, I'm sorry.
No,
I was reading some of this on the plane, and I highlighted something that I thought was really interesting, and I just thought it was this irony just jumped out at me, and how they kept talking about. It says here, furthermore, none of the earlier articles strongly linked the pace of ball games with national characteristics. The Eagles' assessment of the first six contained the strong situation that cricket's destiny was inevitable. It just really was irony about how the fact that one of the things that he really pointed out a couple of times in that chapter was the pace of play and how exciting it was and how it was and why people gravitated to it. And then you look at like where we are today in 2023, and you have the whole pace of play 100 and some odd years later has come back, or 200 years later almost come back full circle. So I just thought that was really fascinating. But I highlighted something here I thought was interesting was he says most ball players were not serious athletes. For the attraction of ball games was not the degree of difficulty, the sheer enjoyment of playing, the social interaction, and the healthful exercise. The complexity of cricket consequently was a major drawback. In fact, the simplicity of baseball and the ease with which it was could be learned won the praise of the press and provided an explanation for its popularity. So I thought that was really interesting, and I think that being a vintage ball player, that's what brings me back to it. It's like you play stickball when you go out and play vintage baseball. You've got a bat and you've got a ball, and that's it. And it's that simplicity that always takes it out. And you look at that versus that, where we are. And he talks also about how you have, the batter just stands there in cricket versus you have 3 outs in baseball. So I thought those were a couple really interesting points that might elaborate on why it exploded.
Well, the pace of play is a good one, although some of that seems to have been after the fact analysis from the newspapers. So while it's a good point, so he also, Adelman adds that some of that is reading it after it already happened. In other words, explaining post facto. But the fact that the pace of play is still an issue, I hadn't even thought about that. And
I thought that was really fascinating.
And you're speaking to someone who hates the pitch clock with a hot, mad passion. Like, I hate the pitch clock almost as much as I hate the designated hitter rule. And I hate the designated hitter rule with a passion I reserve for very few things in this life. Yeah, okay, I'm stand on that. I am.
Ron Bloomberg is a bad name to you.
Yeah, I hate the designated hitter rule.
Does this go back to the idea that there were so many forms of baseball, from the old cat game to the New York game, the Massachusetts game, all those sort of, and they were kind of local inventions. And even as kids, I know when I was playing, we had different rules for the number of kids that showed up that morning.
Yeah,
you could get to the right field side of second base or something like that. And it was these sort of things that, as you mentioned earlier, cricket was cast in stone. You either play it this way or you're not playing cricket.
Yeah, and 1744 is the dividing line. That's when the laws of cricket were actually published. So we're talking about before most of these colonial baseball games are taking place, and of course, even after that, into the United States era, when the game is still in flux, as cricket isn't. And something else that Paul brought up, right? Mm-hmm. Is the simplicity of play makes it, and Adelman makes that point too, that the simplicity of play makes the game more accessible to more players. Whereas cricket players come from England and show off their ridiculously cool skills, beating American teams. American players are able to join anyone. This is a game for everybody. In a way that for some it feels like cricket isn't. I admit, I still don't really understand the rules of cricket. Although, in all fairness, it's their complexity.
As we sit here discussing cricket, I wonder if the expression, it isn't exactly cricket, may have derived from that.
I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised if that's exactly where it came from. It feels like that.
When Albert Spalding took the men over to abroad for his 1888 tour, I remember reading in the book that I talked about with this group a couple months ago. He made a big point of saying, he knew that this was going to be a hard sell in England, but he made a big point of saying that he did not want to replace cricket in England. He just wanted to supplement it with another sport, and that was his big problem, because cricket was so entrenched. But you were talking about children versus men. He said the people in England all viewed baseball as something to be played by boys and teenagers, and Spalding had to really work hard to convince them that this was a sport for men and not just boys.
Yeah.
Uh,
Baseball was played by children in Europe. We know that
Yeah.
for a long time.
yeah.
The earliest reference we have to the game in writing as the word baseball comes from a German source from 1790,
Mm-hmm.
which is a collection of games intended for children,
Mm-hmm.
which the author calls it English baseball
Yeah.
in those
Yeah,
words.
and if you really start to get into David Block's work,
Oh yeah.
Yes.
you find out that baseball is a 17th century game and
Yeah.
comes up all the way from the 1600s,
Well,
all the way
he-
through the 18th century and
he
into
found
the 19th century. It's
he found the
childhood.
first visible evidence as early as 1400
Yeah,
from the I don't remember what manuscript it is, but there's an image from a manuscript dated either the 1400 or 1401 of what is very clearly a man pitching a ball underhanded and a man
Right.
batting it with a bat. So we know bat and ball games were played at least that far back. The Blocks, if you're not familiar with Block stuff, it's terrific.
Mhm.
I can't say enough good things about that book. Yeah,
Uh,
he pushes the frontiers of the game's origin back centuries.
Yeah.
And does so with
he's the guy
excellent
with
documentation.
that. He's got
What's
that
that? I'm sorry, I missed that. What you said?
Peter,
Peter, I
Peter.
missed what you said.
Yeah.
we didn't catch what you said, Peter.
I'm sorry.
We didn't catch what you said about David's books.
Well, David actually wrote two books. The first one was in 2007, of course, and it was earth-shattering in baseball before we knew it.
Oh
And
yeah.
the main premise of that book is that what he really demonstrates, it is absolutely not derived from rounders.
Yeah.
And I mean that was his. I mean that's what his great conclusion is. I mean there's a lot of other factors that come out.
Yeah.
His second book, which is more recent, published about 4 or 5 years ago, is
Pastime
Pastime Lost.
Yeah.
And that's, this is after 8 trips to the UK. And that book really gets into this child's game, not exclusively a children's game, but it's a game that can be played outdoors or indoors. You almost get the feeling it's like punch ball. There's some description of it being like that. There's a very short bat that's used at times also. And
There are
this is
games
the
you actually
game
do
that-
play with your fist. You don't use a
Yeah,
bat at
this
all.
is the game that he finds to be ubiquitous. It's all over, well, at least in Eastern England. And it is happening all over the place and at all kind of levels and in all kinds of circumstances. And it goes on to be, it's called baseball. That's what it
Yeah.
was, called. And he brings up all of these references from the 17th and of course 18th century
Yeah,
and played very much by kids. And I think that is one of the reasons that this author points out that in your book, Kevin, is this constant refrain that you hear about baseball being a manly game, and that coinciding with that muscular Christianity of the 1840s, and there's this even the fly rule would make the game more manly.
Oh yeah.
You know?
That was the whole debate over it. Was
Correct.
not having the fly rule makes the game somehow less manly. And yeah, that you guys know the whole fight over that, no doubt. Because that's and of course there's the issue of women playing the game, which I don't know that Adelman gets into, but we know from Block's work that schoolgirls play. We know from there's a surviving letter from 1748 written by an English upper class woman who mentions playing the game with her family in the wintertime, probably indoors, and makes it clear that it's a game played by her, her husband, her children of every gender. So they're also pushing the game away from non-white, non-male players. And of course, that feeds into this whole broader 19th century and all those issues, which we don't have time to get into.
The whole thing of the fly rule and bound rule and what it seems to me that it's sort of the talk between the separation between children playing and adults playing. It's skill levels and people trying to show off their skill levels, and it's also part of the evolution toward professionalism, because that started to change what skills you had to have to be considered a premier player.
And of course, it's harder to do. It's harder to record an out. You know, I am still impressed by outfielders in the vintage game, for instance, who can handle the kind of velocity that you sometimes get in the outfield. I mean, that's
As every one of my fingers cracks, I couldn't tell you anything about that.
Yeah.
I say that as an infielder who can't judge a fly ball worth a damn, never could. But those are that takes some skill and some guts to pull in balls on their way down like that. But even though the big pop-ups, they gain velocity on the way down, even if there's not much off the bat. And these people were fixated on this argument for years, until they finally, win the fly game, wins out. And there's that big argument that it's the more manly game. They've got nothing to say to children. They've got no interest in extending the game to women. Not that women weren't playing the game, they were. Not that children weren't playing, they were. But this sort of manly obsession, once you start to separate, I don't know if that really feeds back into the whole cricket issue, but it doesn't have to. Because he's talking really there we're talking really about a class, that coming back to that class analysis, where your typical players are middle class white adult males, many of whom are urban dwellers. Philadelphia, Boston, New York, San Francisco briefly, Denver once and again, Chicago definitely, and of course all through the cities of upstate New York, Binghamton. We had some good teams here.
If I may, I know Paul did this, and it really rang a bell. He's something that he spotted. Something that I spotted is a paragraph. I just like, if I may read it.
Please.
It's on page 121 of the book. And essentially what he's doing is he's kind of summing it up in a sense with this paragraph. He's saying between 1845 and the outbreak of the Civil War, so a little bit more than 15 years.
Yeah.
Baseball evolved from a simple, informal child game into an organized sport and standardized rules. That's Doc Adams, 1857.
Yeah.
The increasing press coverage of baseball, the rising spectator interest, the emergence of the statistics, and the appearance of baseball's first guidebook in 1860 further exemplified the modernization and the growing popularity of the sport during these years. And again, it's only a little over 15 years.
Yeah. He also makes the very good point, which I wanted to make at some point, so let me sneak it in, that the reason for the growth of statistics has a lot to do with gambling. That nobody wants to admit it, but standardizing rules and coming up with statistics are first and foremost a benefit to gamblers. And of course, baseball wants to pretend that it had never had anything to do with gambling. Although now they advertise gambling sites at stadiums. But notice, for many, many years, they pretended that gambling was a sin and anyone engaged in it should be driven out without further comment and never allowed back in. That's before they started taking money from gambling websites, I guess. But those are the years that he's focused on, and that's where that question focuses on, that business of the growth of the sport.
Peter, that quotation mentioned the press. He has a whole appendix, I guess it was, just on the press and how it helped popularize baseball, which I thought was just a fascinating section, and how it really started pushing baseball more
I
and
think that's
more.
one of the strengths of this book, actually.
I
is the
thought it
way
was my
that
favorite part of the book.
Yeah, that he talks about the fact that because New York is becoming a media center,
Mm-hmm.
what people say about the game in New York carries more weight than what people are saying and doing anywhere else.
Yeah.
And part of why the New York game wins out over the Boston game.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Boston is not a center of public media like New York is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that I mean it makes sense when you think about it, but it takes stopping to think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because by the 1840s, New York is already home to a number of publishing firms, newspapers, is a communication center growing out of its harbor. And that's been true since 1825, basically,
Mm-hmm.
when the Erie Canal opened and made New York go from port city to metropolis, or at least made it possible. Didn't have to go that way, but it did.
Mm-hmm.
So that connection, and of course the influence of people like Henry Chadwick. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
Chadwick hated the idea of gambling, but let's face it, gamblers loved him. He wouldn't want to hear that. I'd probably get punched if he was here for saying it.
Well, it's
But-
certainly ironic that Chadwick's promotion of statistics at the same time promoted both professionalism and gambling, which neither one of which he was much in favor of.
That's a good point. He also didn't like professionalism. But the first rule of gambling: know the rules before you put your money down. Still good advice today. Don't bet on something where you don't know the rules and don't know whether you're winning or losing. Someone else can tell you whether your money is coming back or not. And it's one of those, those sort of dirty little secrets of the game. He also in that same passage points out the other thing that I thought was sort of fascinating years ago and still is, the idea that baseball tries to create for itself a rural past, when in reality it's largely an urban game and always has been. Because we like to imagine ourselves as this kind of nation of small farmers and so we in America, there's always been this dichotomy between the city as center and the city as home of sin. And so we tend to like to imagine that parts of our culture emerge from the country, not the city. So of course, baseball in its own Garden of Eden, to use Thorne's line, emerges from the country, but gamblers come from the city, because in the city is where gambling happens. Come on, guys. But we know that. Our nation does that a lot. And no surprise, baseball does it too.
It's also where the competition comes from, because there's enough people to compete and put decent teams together. You're not going to go to East Nowhere, Missouri with the town team and have them go 40 miles somewhere else and be able to understand how many games and how many good the players are. But you're right. It's an urban phenomenon.
Yeah. And I include small towns, smaller cities in that too. I mean, I don't know where you guys are physically, but I'm in Binghamton, New York, and the southern tier of New York has this very rich history of league competition between Binghamton, Elmira, places like Sayre, Waverly. I mean, they've been some good teams in places we wouldn't think of having professional baseball. These are not places where major league teams have ever been. And yet, for many years, Waverly, New York fielded some very good teams. Binghamton did, Elmira did.
Troy did too. Troy was a huge player.
Oh yeah. Troy's a little further, a little outside the tier, but Troy was a major league team for a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Utica, likewise, who poached Binghamton's team in 1878. No joke, by the way. Almost the entire 1877 Binghamton Crickets roster ended up in Utica for 1878.
That's okay. The 1880s Bisons ended up in Detroit, but we don't want to talk about that. I'm in Buffalo.
Yeah, poaching other people's teams is a time-honored tradition. People did it all the time. But that's that was part of that whole tendency toward professionalism. You recruit the best players you can, to the point where we're at now. It's something that sort of connects to the present, where today, let's face it, if you're rooting for a professional sports team today, you're rooting for jerseys and whatever bodies happen to be occupying them this season. Because the guys on your team may not be the same guys who were playing for that team last year. How many New York Yankees are actually born or raised in New York? Actually, I don't even know that. Is it Ed, or do any of them come from New York?
Volpe.
Volpe, yeah. That's about it.
When I said it, I realized I wasn't sure if there was any of them. Okay, so what? So 26 guys on the
One that
roster,
we know
one.
of.
Yeah, one we can
Bader
think of
was
offhand.
too, but not anymore.
That's the point, is that they call themselves a New York team. Their connection to New York is these days tenuous. Whereas once these teams were built often of locals with a few ringers pulled in.
But even in the 1800s, that was true on the really competitive teams.
Yeah. After what Harry Wright did in Cincinnati. That's up to that point, your teams were often local with a ringer or two pulled in. Whereas Wright goes for, I don't care where these people come from. This is the Cincinnati team now. They come from everywhere that isn't Cincinnati, and I don't care.
Yeah, because there's one Cincinnatian on that team. I think the team that I did so much research on, Louisville always had half the team was Louisvillians or Kentuckians, and they were always at the bottom of the league.
Aren't they the ones who also had several players thrown out for gambling?
In 77, yeah.
Yeah.
But none of them were locals. They were one of them was an original Hulbert signee. Devlin was from Chicago, or he's from Philadelphia, but he played for Chicago in 76, and Hulbert passed him on to Louisville because they needed some help.
Yeah. And you could get away with it in those days. I mean, hell, they traded players. You could own more than one team even.
In the late 90s, yeah.
Yeah. Eventually they put a stop to that, but
a pretty rapid succession. This author, starting at around 1857, of course, he talks about Doc Adams' rules. The following years, the formation of the National Association of Baseball Players.
Yeah.
1858. By 1860, this is what really surprised me in the book, was that they officially created a National Association of Junior Baseball Players.
Yeah.
And that, to me, speaks volumes, because essentially that begins to set up the feed. And, when you start to look at people like Creighton and, others, they started on junior teams. They started on the Stars of, Brooklyn and so forth and so on. And the next thing you know, they're playing, at the top level. So, I found that very interesting. I found that to be a significant leap in a sense. And that's around 1860, by the way, which is the same year of the very first baseball guide, as the author points out. Yeah. Beatles guide that Chadwick authored.
And only 3 years, if I'm remembering this right, 3 years after the first game that you had to pay admission to get into.
Well, yes, the first game is the Fashion Race Course game. Yeah. That's the first admission
1857,
game.
If I'm remembering it right.
Yeah. And that's 1858.
58, was it? I had 57 in my head.
Yeah,
I'm not certain.
It's a year after Doc.
Yeah. Without a note in front of me, I'm not certain of that. So if you say 58, then you're probably correct. As I am uncertain.
Yeah, I had to reread it.
Yeah, well, so did I. I just don't remember the exact year. Fashion Race Course, definitely. I'm blanking on the year. But that, we're in that point, is we're in that era where the idea of charging people to see a game is becoming a thing.
Right. And it was done as a charity, which was common, by the way.
Yeah.
Or became common as a benefit. They did a benefit, but it did begin to create that scenario of having a gate, having a fence, and so forth and so on. You know?
And he adds on that part of that was, I don't remember if it's Adelman or somewhere else I read that the point of putting up a gate and a fence and charging admission wasn't so much to make the money as to keep out people who were unwanted. In other words, as a class barrier. Don't have a quarter? Go away. You're not welcome here.
Yeah, he makes a good point of that. Something that really wasn't in my mind, but as it was in a sense, a class thing. If somebody doesn't have a quarter to get in, well,
Yeah,
they're pretty
Or-
down and out.
Yeah, or even raising the rates that way for the express purpose of excluding people who can't afford it, which is, very much a city thing all over the damn place, from the choice of locations of places to the where Central Park South starts, to make sure that facilities would be accessible to the upper class, possibly the middle class, and definitely not the poor.
Yeah, when you think about that, that did set a tone that really was one of the foundations of Holbert's formation of the National League. And one of the requirements was to charge 50 cents admission, as opposed to a quarter.
Yeah,
to keep out the riffraff.
Yeah, that's exactly that. Keeping out, to use the word riffraff. Yeah, you don't have 50 cents. This is not for you.
Well, crowds had become a problem at ball games. That's becoming a problem. And how do you keep them out? Well, that's how you keep them out.
Yeah.
Charge something. I mean, you have to have a basis for letting people in, right?
Yeah.
And that's a way of doing it. It's like rationing any other scarce resource.
And we know how rowdy they got. I'm blanking on names at the moment, but I was reading the other day about a number of umpires, one of whom regularly carried a revolver and needed it because the crowds would not only get rowdy, they would get violent.
Yeah.
And on several occasions, he found himself confronted by a mob who wanted to beat the hell out of him, and saved himself a beating by pointing a gun at people, which he kept in his pocket while working as an umpire. So yeah, that's very much a good point about the nature of crowds. And of course, the whole thing that you keep coming back to gender for a moment, of trying to invite women to come to games on the assumption that the crowd will be better behaved if women are present. Because that assumption isn't just unspoken. There are people trumpeting that from the rooftops.
There's no telling what would happen with this group if Joanne wasn't here.
There you are then. Are we going to get rowdy now? But that assumption is very 19th century. And notice a number of organizations, leagues, teams that keep trying to find a way to attract more women to come to the games.
Well, I think it goes back to the press again, and two different things. As I read through a lot of accounts, you always see there's two things that always stand out to me, and one of them is a fair number of ladies will be present, or ladies will be expected to show, and they always trumpet the ladies, the ladies, the ladies.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I always find interesting when you read some of these old game accounts is they also make a comment about the umpire, and a lot of them you'll read stories of like, the umpire came from Troy, and I hope he goes back there and never comes back again. If he does a bad job, they'll flame him in the paper the next day. And it's actually pretty humorous to read some of these accounts, but the ladies is huge. One of the first accounts of a New York rules game here in Buffalo is that, they made a 2-sentence comment about, and there will be many ladies present with carriages and this, and again, there's ladies going to be there. They made a huge point of it. So
yeah, yes, yes.
You were talking about the riffraff. I read a lot of the William Hubbard letters at the Chicago History Museum. I think it was to Dennis McKnight. Was he a
Pittsburgh.
Yeah, Pittsburgh, yeah. And he was going on and on. It says, we must do this and we must do that. I can't remember his exact words, but he made it quite clear that that was one of the reasons he disliked the American Association too, is because he thought baseball should only have a certain type of people should be attending games, and he wanted to keep the other ones out.
Oh yeah. And of course, gamblers would attract the kind of people he doesn't want.
Mm-hmm.
which is
Yeah.
part of his animus toward them. But this
Well, just
belief
to
that-
loop in real quick, sorry, we
No,
just
please.
our last book we did was on the groundskeeping Murphy brothers too. And one of the
Oh,
big
yeah.
things that he talked about was the land and where the land was and where it was, and how the good land always didn't exist, but you had the worst land, but then the worst land also had the different, maybe you were in a worse part of town and it attracted a different crowd. So that was a really interesting thing he brought up in that book, which kind of parallels back to that thought too.
That's a good point.
Hmm. Yeah.
The neighborhood you put anything matters, especially in a world where transportation is not always convenient.
Hmm.
And it costs. I mean, it's the same thing with that bit about Central Park being where it is. Far enough from poor neighborhoods that you need to pay for transportation to get there. Walking is not really practical if you intend to have any time there. And that's very deliberate. So, put your park in a nicer neighborhood, and poor people can't afford to even get there. Never mind can afford the entry fee.
Hmm.
Good point, Saul.
There was something I did note that was in a chapter. It was actually chapter 7 of the book. And there were 2 points that I made here. I wrote down because it brings us back to cricket for a moment. And there was so during this period, we're talking about the period of 1860 to 1870, and this whole period now is really, really into the professional amateur issue.
Right.
And one of the leading New York ball players, baseball people at the time, managers, was Frank Pigeon. And I made a note here that Pigeon was a guy who really pushed back on professionalism. He was a guy that felt that baseball should be played sheerly for the love of the game, not for any kind of money. And that was his stance, and he was pretty prominent in baseball and pretty prominent in pushing this type pushback on professionalism. But at the same time, I found this interesting. Part of the decline of American cricket was their ability as wealthy individuals to pay professionals. So by that decade, the 1860s, 1870s, most cricket players are assuming the role of professionals, that they're being paid by their wealthy patrons of their clubs. And oftentimes the guys who are not actually on the field, but are involved in the background. And that may have also contributed to their decline because of that pushback on professionalism, because it was still in flux at that point.
Good point as well. Hadn't really thought of that.
He
You
made that point, yeah.
Yeah, I kind of slid past that one, but you catch it nicely. That the connection there with growing professionalism in cricket. Yeah, especially in the Civil War and immediate post-Civil War years, when so many people were playing the game recreationally and brought it with them back from the war.
There's one other thing that came to my mind about the Civil War in relation to the decline of cricket. There's a lot of tension in the United States, and I didn't get this particularly from his book, but I also read the life of Henry Adams. And Henry Adams is, of course, the son of, he's the grandson of John Quincy Adams. And his father, Henry Adams' father, is Lincoln's ambassador to the United Kingdom during the Civil War. And there's this tremendous amount of tension of which way England is going to go. Are they going to really give up Southern cotton because they have, this pretty big manufacturing, set up, with cotton fabric and so forth and so on. So that may have played a role in a lot of Northerners maybe very anxious about the UK in relation to the Civil War. And maybe that also contributed to the decline of cricket. I'm not sure, but speculating a little bit.
It's worth thinking about, because there were people in England who were lobbying for England to recognize the Confederates. They never did so, but there were some prominent English people who hoped that they would. And you could use that. I'm familiar with at least one case in the South of a spy who made his way through the South, acting as if he was an Englishman and implying that he had powerful friends in Parliament. And if the Confederates would impress him with their strength, he would talk to his buddies back in England. He was actually an American spy. So the Confederates literally gave him tours of their military facilities so that he could go back to England and explain to his buddies how effective their army was going to be.
Well, the North was trying to blockade the South to keep cotton from moving to England. And while the North was doing that blockade, England was buying cotton whenever they could from the South.
Yeah, although by that point, England was buying much of their cotton from Egypt and from India, which is part of what figures into their decision not to get involved. They have enough. They have two other places they can exploit for cotton, India in particular.
Yeah.
And that's still true so many years later. That's why you see Gandhi hand spinning cotton. That's a reaction to the fact that the English were barring Indian factories from existing and forcing Indians to sell raw cotton to English merchants. So here's, 80 years later, here's Gandhi saying, don't sell them your raw cotton. Spin it into cloth with medieval technology if you have to, but don't sell it to them at any price, because that's what they want here. And if they can't get it, they're more inclined to go away. They catch that even in the movie. Ben Kingsley, by the way, great movie. I expect some of you probably saw it. Yeah, no, it's a good point though, and that's that connection. I don't know if I've never seen anything concrete to it, but it's certainly worth thinking about. The connection between England and cricket, between anxiety over what England will do. And for that matter, we tend to forget this now, but up until the era of the First World War, England was the enemy, often as not. Who else have we fought 2 wars against? I mean, who else offended us like that? Entering with something a lot of people, most of you probably realize, entering World War I, if you took a poll in America as to which side you're on, Germany probably wins. There's more Americans that are that speak German as a second language. And what has Germany ever done to offend us? England, we fought 2 wars against. What have the Germans ever done to piss us off?
Also, the immigration from Ireland didn't do English thought any good.
Yeah. So maybe there is something to that. If the cricket is still associated with England, as it is, if you call yourself the St. George Club of all things, maybe there is some sort of undercurrent of animosity there that says the hell with these people and the hell with their game.
Well, let us finish on the denigration of England as quarter English. I'm going to have to get over that somehow. On half the Welsh, so we have the same attitude toward England. But nevertheless, Kevin, it's been a wonderful hour 10 that we've had here. Really appreciate you, the preparation and the insight that we've had here. And thank everyone who came. We had a very nice back and forth here in a number of issues popping up and down. And we look forward to the October session, which will show up in the newsletter, and we'll also get out a notice through the general SABR messaging system by the end of this week. That'll give you the dates and books and presenters for the next quarter.
Cool.
Do you know the October book yet, or can you not say?
Unmute, Peter.
Okay, there's one book a month.
Yeah.
It's 3 months. And
what is October?
Actually, I'm going to kick off the first book, which will be Bill Ryzak's middle book of his famous trilogy, When Johnny Comes Sliding Home. And, he's really talking about the Civil War era baseball in that book. And of course, his first book was discussed this summer, Blackguards and Red Stockings. And Bill wrote them in reverse order, so we're going to present them in reverse order.
But let me
second
thank,
book-
let me thank Kevin again. We look forward
my
to
pleasure.
what your selection for your next book and getting you
Right,
into
then
the
second,
final
yeah.
quarter. And we're going to start. This
I
has
gotta-
been a.
I gotta hunt that one.
all right, I just want to, if I may, just want to mention the three books. The second book, the one in November, is another classic. Jack Fields is going to be doing the Beer and Whiskey League, David Nemec's book.
Mhm.
And
That
in
one I've
December, we have Jim Chikulski again. He's going to be doing the third book is Ed Eckhorn's a book about Horst Radford.
Would you mind putting these in an email somewhere so we have?
Yeah,
No,
that-
they're coming
Because
to-
some of
they're
these I
coming
have not
tomorrow.
read and I want to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they're
this
coming-
Friday we'll get that out.
Yeah, it'll be out
tomorrow.
tomorrow. The email will be out tomorrow. Then it'll be in the newsletter in 2 weeks.
Cool. All right. Well,
Yeah,
hey,
he's
thank you, everybody.
Thank
Take
Ken.
care.
Thank you, Kevin.
Paul,
Thank
Have a
you.
good have a good night. And again, thank you for joining us. It's always been a fun session
Yeah.
with the exchanges.
yeah,
Sure
Paul,
is.
can you hear me?
I can.
Would you mind sticking around one more moment to talk vintage baseball?
Sure,
Do you have a
absolutely.
moment? Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you. Because I have something to ask you about that, but I don't know if that interests anyone else.
Okay,
Thanks, everybody.
thank you all. I
Take care,
will be here
everybody.
also because I'm the one that controls the on and off for the.
Oh, well, then I promise I won't
So-
take too long. But
Okay, go ahead.
But Paul, I did want to ask you, you said you're from Buffalo.
I am born and raised and sitting there now. What can I do for you?
Do you have a vintage team in Buffalo?
That's a long story. I play in Rochester. I used to with the Victory Baseball Club up at Genesee Country Village Museum.
Okay,
I
know
actually
those
split
people.
my time between Buffalo and Denver. I play with Colorado Vintage Baseball Association pretty much exclusively out there. So I get about 10 games in a year, but I'm a right fielder for them. So yes,
Okay.
I'm a huge vintage guy.
Because I have been for the last couple of years attempting to put together a ball club to represent Binghamton.
Really?
Yes,
Really?
and my problem has been locating people willing to play. So
Have
every time
you
I
reached
encounter,
out to like the vintage, VBBA or
we're
other
already members of
folks?
we're already members of the BBBA.
Okay.
All I'm lacking is players. I got the structure in place, got a bank account in place, got the VBBA membership. I literally have everything except 10 warm bodies.
Send me an email directly, or I can send you one. What I
Okay.
might do is maybe put you in touch with some of the Rochester guys and just see if they can give you some ideas up at Genesee Country. I don't know if you've talked to anybody or familiar
That's-
with anybody up there.
Yeah, I actually went there for the tournament one year
Uh-huh.
to talk to people.
Silver Ball.
Yeah, I was hoping to actually have a team on the field this year, and we got an email from them asking if we wanted to play, but we didn't have, I can't count on enough people showing up
Yeah,
to
that's
take a spot at the tournament and then worry that half the people I'm hoping for are going to disappear.
that, my
don't know if you've
friend,
had that
is
experience.
that's an issue that, and especially after COVID, plagues every vintage team. I played in a game 2 weeks ago, and we had 7. We recruited from the team from the actual crowd to play, and
Yeah.
then 3 days later we had 16. So it's hit or miss, and it's extremely difficult. So how you would, sorry, my cat is in my way. How you
Nice.
would actually reach out or get, that's tough. And I don't know. I've never started one from scratch. I've always joined into the league, and then getting
Well,
players is extremely difficult. So
Yeah, I mean, if there was a
Okay.
team in our area already, I would have just go ahead.
All
and
right, I
joined,
gotta
but-
ask you,
Yeah.
I gotta ask you guys to sign off because Bob does, he's live here and we
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
do anything without him signing off.
Okay,
But
what's your?
I'll
I hope
send
you
you,
continue, I hope you continue this on email, really.
yeah,
because-
I'll
Yeah,
send you an email, Kevin, and we can converse from there. Okay.
Okay, do you have my email address?
You can get
you're
email
the
addresses
moderator,
from
so
the
I should.
SABR website.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, or
I
yeah,
gotcha.
or just jump on the website and do it that way. Okay, I'll keep an eye out for your email. Thank
All
you,
right.
Paul.
Have a good one, guys.
Okay,
Good
thank you
night.
very much,
Good night,
guys.
Paul. Good night,
Good night,
Kevin.
everybody.
Good night.
Good night, Peter.
Good night, all.
Bye, good night.